tonight I want us to think back to Christmas 100 years ago in England. And that Christmas was a bittersweet one back in 1918. And that is a bit of an understatement. For just 6 weeks before that Christmas of 1918, World War I, or the Great War as they called it, ended. And there was relief and some rejoicing, of course, in England, but also lingering and deep loss. For the British casualties were appalling in the Great War and cut across class lines, and so there was hardly anyone in England who had not lost family or friends in that war. And there's so many stories I could tell you, some of which are just heart-rending. There's so many stories I could tell you about the impact of World War I on England, but I will briefly tell the story of just two men. And the first is J.R. Tolkien. Now, when the war broke out in August of 1914, J.R. Tolkien was a student at Oxford. Now, he knew that he would need to serve in the military, but he wanted to complete his last year of studies. So he was under some pressure to go ahead and enlist, but he knew that he needed to complete his last year of studies if he were to have any means of support after the war. So he stood his ground and he remained a student. But when he returned to Oxford in the fall of 1914, just a few weeks after the war began, the university was already drastically changed with much fewer students, and because many of the undergraduates went off to war, and most student clubs and societies therefore ceased to operate. And the transformation of the university and college facilities to military use was already well underway. It prompted Tolkien to write to his love, Edith, that, quote, "the gloom of this place is terrible," unquote. And I can tell you sometimes at Oxford in the fall, it's not the brightest place in the world anyway. But yeah, it was really a gloomy fall that fall, especially. And now he enrolled in the Officer Training Corps while completing his studies. And he actually found the military drills in the parks around Oxford a godsend that suited his health and energy well. He wrote Edith that the drills even helped banish the infamous Oxford sleepies. And I can testify, being in Oxford, that there's something about the atmosphere of the place as the days grow shorter that can make you sleepy. But the drills kind of helped him kind of keep his energy up. Well, Tolkien did complete his studies in June of 1915 with a first-class degree, and he then joined the British Army immediately. And after training in signaling, which is perfect for his talent in languages, he was shipped off to the Western Front in 1916 for the Somme offensive. And he and Edith married beforehand in March of 1916. Now, before I tell you of what happened in Tolkien in battle, I will tell you what became of some of his friends. This is a photo of the freshman class of Exeter College in 1911? 1911. Tolkien is right there. And that's J.R. Tolkien right there, okay? Now, you see that there's a smaller picture, and it's the same photo, but some people are kind of lightened, but other people remain highlighted in their normal state. The ones that are colored in their normal state, they died in World War I. That's roughly a third of the freshman class of Exeter College, Oxford. Okay, so that's what became of so many of Tolkien's classmates. Another group were Tolkien's best friends. In this book, Tolkien and the Great War, excellent book by the way, focuses on four very intelligent buddies at the King Edward School before the war. And I guess King Edward School would be well, we would call it a prep school. They would call it a public school, I think is what they call it. But I think we would consider it a prep school. And there were four very intelligent buddies at King Edward School. That's Rob Gilson, Christopher Wiseman, Jeffrey Smith, and Tolkien. Well, Smith died of shellfire wounds in France. Rob Gilson died leading his men in the first day of the Somme Offensive, July 1st, 1916, the bloodiest day in British military history. Only Christopher Wiseman and Tolkien survived the war, and Tolkien named his third son after Christopher Wiseman. In the preface of the second edition of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote, "One has indeed personally to come under the shadow of war to feel fully its oppression. But as the years go by, it seems now often forgotten that to be caught in youth by 1914 was no less hideous an experience than to be involved in 1939 and the following years." Obviously, he wrote this after World War II. And then this sentence, which when I saw this at the exhibition in Oxford, it really grabbed me. "By 1918, all but one of my close friends were dead." Okay? So, so Tolkien had some very personal loss during World War I. But as you probably have guessed, Tolkien survived. How? Well, by God's providence, really. He was engaged in a number of battles on the Western Front in the summer of 1916, the summer of the Great Battle of the Somme, in which British casualties were in the 6 digits. But in late October, he came down with trench fever. And trench fever is something you would catch, I think, from lice that were in the trenches. The situation, without getting into too much detail, the situation in the trenches was really unpleasant, and sometimes people caught trench fever. And as it usually did, it recurred so that he never fully regained his health during the war. He did some military service on the British coast, but he was not returned to the Western Front. Now, trench fever was a nasty, debilitating disease that sometimes took years to fully get over, but we have trench fever and God's providence to thank for The Hobbit and for the Lord of the Rings. Now, the second man is not as well known, Eric Milner White. Who is Eric Milner White? Well, in 1914, he was a chaplain at King's College, Cambridge. And when war was declared in early August, he immediately volunteered to be a chaplain in the British Army. His service during the war included the Western Front and its horror. And most of his wartime letters were lost, unfortunately, but we do have this that he wrote. "Battle is indescribable, unimaginable. The fresh night air was itself a rushing road, like a waterfall, as 1,000 shells tore through it. The dark blue sky was lit up by a summer lightning flash upward from the earth every second. The darker, motionless clumps of poplars all around the horizon were continually silhouetted in white flame. The continuous firework of light balls went up from the German trenches, but most awesome was the noise. We felt so powerless against those splitting cracks and roars, and dreamt of the metal tearing its way into the bodies of poor men. I have had another battle, my 9th with this division. A thing of special horror became a repulse in the wind and the rain and the abomination of slow. Without a rest, I could not be of much further use to the army out here, or perhaps ever again to anybody." Under such harsh conditions, he served well and beyond the call of duty. And from some accounts, that include repeatedly going into no man's land between the trenches under fire to bring back the wounded. He was awarded a DSO, a Distinguished Service Order. His duties also exhausted him, as you can imagine, and that was one reason he returned to King's College in early 1918 after 3 years of service. In May 1918, he was elected Dean of the Chapel of King's College. He was the only nominee. And at a meeting a week later, it was agreed that the deans be requested to consider what modifications, if any, are desirable for the improvement of chapel services. And the armistice of November 11th, 1918, surely strengthened Milner White's conviction that a change in services, especially special occasional services, was needed. Milner White especially felt that change in the Christmas Eve service was needful. Just 6 weeks after the armistice, this would be the first Christmas after the end of the Great War, a war in which virtually everyone in the congregation lost family and friends. Now, Dean White was aware of a 9 lessons and carols service instituted at Toro Cathedral in 1880 by the future Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward White Benson. The practice briefly became popular, but then fell back into disuse. Milner White was also surely aware of the medieval practice of lessons and carols liturgy for some high holy days. So in 1918, he took that idea, modified it, and started the 9 lessons and carols service on Christmas Eve that since has become famous and is broadcast around the world and on the internet. I listen to it every Christmas Eve at 9 a.m. from the BBC. Perhaps the most important modification he made in the 9 lessons and carols liturgy was the creation of the bidding prayer near the beginning of the service. It is used with little change to this day. Near the end of the prayer is this: "Lastly, let us remember before him them who rejoice with us, but upon another shore, and in a greater light, that multitude which no man can number, whose hope was in the Word made flesh, and with whom, in this Lord Jesus, we forevermore are one." One can imagine how much this touched the congregation who had lost so many friends and family on another shore. And now broadcast around the world, as well as being available on several CDs, this service touches millions every Christmas to this day, including me. And I can particularly relate to this description. Somehow, from the moment the first boy starts to sing, there's a shiver that runs down your back. And from that moment until the end of the service and lingering long afterward, you have this extraordinary emotional upheaval which has the habit of recurring. You always think, this could never happen to me again. And when you hear it again, exactly the same thing happens. That's me every Christmas Eve, I confess. And by the way, our Christmas Eve lessons and carol service is inspired by this godly innovation of Eric Milner White. So this Christmas, let us also remember those who suffered great loss because of World War I. And remember that Christmas 100 years ago in England. But above that, let us rejoice that God delights in turning great loss into great gain, that he delights in bringing light out of darkness. God certainly brought the light of J.R. Tolkien and Eric Milner White out of the Great War. Thank you.